In the wake of the death of 37-year-old Somali Canadian Robyn Abdi following a violent encounter with a member of the Ottawa Police, many in our community have been asking difficult questions about how racialized communities are policed and the pervasiveness of racism in Canada. This afternoon, Adrian had a conversation with activist and writer Robyn Maynard about her new book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present, to get some answers. Here's their conversation.
Robyn Maynard, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you a lot for having me on the show.
Robyn, why did you want to write this book? What kind of conversations were you hoping to spark?
That's a great question. So, I think we're living really in the era of Black Lives Matter, when we're really starting to look at the grossly disproportionate police killings that Black civilians are incurring, the over-incarceration of Black communities, the way that Black youth are being streamlined out of schools and expelled grossly disproportionately across the country. Of course, the crisis of carding and racial profiling that's existing, in Kingston, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Edmonton, all across the country. I feel that we really didn't have a historical perspective that made sense of all of this. If we think about the United States, I think many of us have an understanding, of course, that the history of enslavement and slavery in the United States has led to the ongoing conditions that are faced by Black populations there. But in Canada, very few people are aware, actually, of the fact that slavery was legal for over 200 years in this country. And are not aware, for example, of the fact that, the last segregated school in Canada that segregated Black students from white actually closed in 1983. So I think that there's really a lack of understanding of the long-standing legacy of anti-Black racism from slavery that has led us to this crisis point that we're experiencing in the present.
This book, of course, is about the contemporary world, but it's also about the way in which we see or the way in which we imagine Canadian history. What is it that we don't understand about our history in relation to anti-Blackness that we need to?
I think something that people really don't understand is really the history of, these assumptions of linking Black people to criminality, this assumption that Black people are less able to feel pain, that Black people are dangerous, that these understandings and ways of treating and seeing Black people actually stem back to the history of slavery, when Black people were considered property, when they were considered not humans, when Black people were considered criminal just for, daring to escape bondage. They were called runaway slaves and treated as criminals, right? So I think that we don't often understand that so many of the really negative perceptions and really the horrific treatment of Black people across state institutions is something that really has, a legacy that can be traced back 400 years.
And yet, when a lot of people look at Canadian history in relation to Black people, they see Canada as being, or it was, a sanctuary. This was a place where formerly enslaved peoples came to escape from their condition in the United States. What's wrong with that understanding of Canadian history?
That version of Canadian history is very narrow and very misleading in its scope, because often in that narrative, when you look at sort of Canada as the place of sanctuary for Black people fleeing through the Underground Railroad, it often doesn't mention that actually people could be legally enslaved in Canada only 30 years before that. It also doesn't talk about, in Ontario, where many Black people were fleeing to in the era of the Underground Railroad. That was when legalized segregated schooling was instituted. So we often don't actually look at the many forms of oppression that were actually created and recreated in Canada, including, segregation across many aspects of public life, Black people not being able to be in some towns after dark until the mid-20th century. So it's a very selective reading of history to look at it as only a place of sanctuary, when actually we can see very many moments in Canadian history of racial violence that's been directed at Black populations as well.
So how do we see anti-Blackness manifested in the here and now? Oftentimes we see state violence as being police brutality. But in your book you talk about other kinds of state violence. Can you perhaps talk about that?
Absolutely. Of course, police brutality is a very important element of how that takes place. According to one study, Black people are 10 times more likely to be killed by the police than white. But we often don't look at, for example, the way that Black families are subject to, being separated by the child welfare system at grossly disproportionate rates. We don't look at the harm that actually incurs on young Black children and on Black parents. We often don't look at the dehumanizing ways that Black kids are actually treated in schools. For example, if you look to the case just last year of a 6-year-old girl weighing 48 pounds who was handcuffed together by the wrists and the ankles in her school, because they said that it was to protect herself and others, right? So I think that we often don't look at these many other locations that Black people are also subjected to, disproportionate surveillance and as well violence at times.
And yet some people are going to say, Robyn Maynard, you're just cherry picking all these terrible things that happen in Canada, when the fact is that Black experiences are very diverse, and there might also be an argument that you're blaming the state when maybe you need to be holding Black people themselves responsible for their actions, for their transgressions, maybe looking at Black culture or Black families. What do you say to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that stems from, again, this longstanding pathologization that really blames Black people for the harms that have been enacted upon them, right? So that says that, for example, I mean, Black people are blamed for their own deaths all the time, even when they're unarmed Black people that are killed by the police, if they have a criminal record that dates back even 15 years, right? But I think we need to look to the fact that Black people are actually not more likely to commit crimes than white Canadians. However,
so that's a myth.
That's right, that's a myth, but actually, at the same time, Black populations are incarcerated at a rate that's 3 times our makeup in the general population. So that's something that only really speaks to something that comes out of racial profiling and disparities all across the criminal justice system. So I think we really just need to have, an accurate and empirical look. And if, like, for example, the United Nations actually just looked at a massive amount of studies that have been done on Black Canadians, and they really measured these disparities all across state institutions and said that this is a reason that we really need to look at the issues of structural injustice facing Black communities. So although Black activists really have been discussing this and bringing this to the forefront for centuries, this is also something that has been validated, of course, by outside studies, right? So
there might be a counter to your argument, and people might say, well, Robyn, if in fact Canada was anti-Black, there would not have been a Governor General who was Black, Michael Jean, who came to this country in the 1960s, families from Haiti. Or, for example, there wouldn't be an immigration minister, Ahmed Hussein, who is a refugee from Somalia. He's Black. So how can it be that Canada is an anti-Black society?
I think that we really need to understand it on a structural level. What you're speaking to, I think, is a particularly Canadian phenomenon that some people call brown or Black faces in high places, right? That often stands in for actually addressing societal injustices that span institutions. So even if you are able to have a few individuals rise within the ranks, if you look to levels of poverty, if you look to the statistics around police stops, if you look to incarceration, for example, we see that on the structural level, Black people are nowhere near equality in this country, even though we might have a few, faces that seem to represent a different story.
You say that Black women are particularly impacted by anti-Blackness. How is that?
Thank you for asking that. I think that, all Black people of all genders, of all abilities, of all incomes are really impacted by racism in different ways. And if we look too closely to only make sort of the lens of racial profiling or policing more generally to be that of the Black man, we often don't see the other kinds of harms that are enacted on Black women, for example. If we look most recently, to the case of Majisa Phillip, just a few years ago, who's a Black woman that had her arm broken by the police, or if we look to, the report came out in the 1990s that Black women behind bars were saying that they were facing, racist and sexist remarks and also sexual assault by prison guards, right? So I think that we often don't look to the unique forms of violence that Black women are facing because we have a certain idea in our heads of who is the victim and who's the legitimate victim of policing.
In this community, of course, we are dealing with still the case of Robyn Maynard. We know that a police officer has been charged in the case. What's the way forward? Where do you see us, in this community of Ottawa, but in the larger community, in the larger Canadian context? How do you see us moving to a place where anti-Blackness would no longer be a reality in this country?
I think there are many different models we can look towards. For example, after the police killing of Pierre Coriolan, who was another man like Abdirahman Abdi, who, in what seemed to be a mental health crisis, was killed by the police. There was a protest that happened afterwards that I myself was involved in, but many others, including Black Lives Matter Toronto. And one of the demands that came out of that was to actually have a national strategy to address, mental health in Black communities that is not one that is punitive. To not have police be the first responders in terms of mental health crises, for which, particularly with Black populations, we know that those situations too frequently escalate into harm and even death. We need to see just an outright ban on the practice of carding. Those are just a few examples, I think, of absolutely necessary steps that need to be taken immediately in order to address this issue.
Robyn Maynard, it's good of you to join us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.